Welcome back to the Mentor Roulette grind. This time, once again, somehow, the Wheel of Jobs decided that we play Paladin, yet another tank, on a Monday evening. And this was a pretty okay mix of dungeons featuring some raids. Nothing too challenging though. That said, for Duty 1, we went to Tender Valley, and the healer was excellent. It felt very much like throughout the duty, we were adjusting around each other's sprint planning to get through as quickly and efficiently as possible. Same for cooldowns, of course. On the first boss, our Black Mage got sniped by the knockback mechanic, and as a returning player, I imagine it was the surprise itself. As a result, I also made use of cover to protect them from prickly right a bit later. On the final boss, both of our DPS suddenly died from the line AoEs from the topsy-turvying serpents. I imagine our healer was a bit too quick on the trigger with them choosing to raise the Black Mage first, but we still managed to push onward. As our summoner got back up, the Black Mage goes back down again as a result of the Great Torrent. A general tip for Paladin in Tender Valley is to make use of the ranged capacity of Holy Spirit. For example, on the first boss, you can use it to tide you over during the knockback mechanic. On the final boss, if you can make heavy use of the full magic burst while dealing with the greatest labyrinth, so you don't feel as much that you need to hurry back. This can compensate for the fact your fight or flight timer might overlap with the mechanic. Now, that said, the duty went pretty fine despite the minor issues we had on the first and last boss. For Duty 2, we went to Qitana Ravel, which, considering the relation between Tender Valley and Qitana Ravel, is quite a funny coincidence. That said, we had a Sprout Dragoon that had some issues with some of the bosses, and a Sage that may have been a bit in love with the diagnosis buttons. Hey, I mean, if it works. And didn't seem to be a big fan of Dyscrasia. They also seem to be using Toxicon on single target while standing still, which is mostly a shame because Toxicon is actually weaker than doses on single target in this specific level range. Aside from that, the duty went pretty well. On the first boss, the Dragoon got sniped by some of the half-room cleaves. Remember, look at the arm of the boss and look at the eyes of the statues down the hall. You may need to tip your camera. On the second boss, the Dragoon got sniped by the tilting rocks. I believe the indicator here is that there is an unnatural shadow pointing in the general direction the rock will fall in. I would say general advice here is to lean away from the rocks if possible, or at least further out of the arena as the rocks tend to aim inward. Depending on your position, you can just sidestep in the last moment if needed. On this pull just before the final boss, there is a little trick. If you pull the pack inside this rocky area, out of there, while no players are inside it, the gorilla monsters will come down immediately. If you do it wrong, the gorillas will stay up there until the pack is dead or until you get it right. Simply pull the pack out of the area and have all players go out with them, and the gorillas will come down. On the final boss, I have a few tips. The first one is that the spiky tether here turns purple and not spiky if you move far enough away. This is the intended way to solve it. If you're confident in your group and you are melee, you can, of course, stay close to not lose damage uptime, but it does hurt a lot, so it could turn around and cost your healer damage as a result. The second tip is that when the boss hops to the edge and casts either fire or lightning, you don't really need to look at what the boss is doing. Spread markers means the boss will shoot a cone down the middle of the arena. A stack marker means it instead shoots down the sides. The final tip is that when the poison circles come down, if you are a job with a gap closer of some sort, keep it at hand. You can either cancel the knockback with arm's length or surecast, or you can knockback cancel it by simply using your gap closer once the pushback starts, causing minimal uptime loss. It is also quite convenient because it means you can mostly ignore the entirety of all the poison pools in the arena. For Duty 3, we went to Brayflox Longstop, and we had a Thaumaturge in the group, which is not a good sign. You should be a Black Mage by now. This of course immediately draws all of my attention and makes it difficult to ignore. What I observed was that they mainly used Blizzard, Blizzard 2 and Thunder. They would even use Blizzard 2 on single target. Regularly, they also used Transpose to switch into Fire, only to then cast Blizzard again. Now, first, a tip or two for this first section of the duty itself. Assuming your healer keeps up with you, it is a very good idea to pull the first AoE pull up to the little hut with a goblin, as this both makes it easier for someone to grab the key from the goblin, but also very likely causes the ranged monkey mobs to naturally clump together, which does indeed mean, once the key is grabbed, carry the rest of the pack down to the monkeys. The second tip is that the plant in the second pull will use an AoE silence at some point in the fight, so healers should stay a bit away. Mage DPS may also prefer to keep their distance. Bringing echo drops is also a good idea just in general, but especially so for Dark Knights, as this silence also stops on leash. A very rarely helpful but notable tip is that echo drops, I'm pretty sure, can be used on other players, so if you brought some and your healer didn't, you can help them out. Now, back to the thaumaturge thing. I spent the time up to the first boss mainly thinking about how I would go about explaining to them how to maybe improve. By the end of the second boss, I had instead concluded that, considering how incredibly strange what they were already doing was, my advice could easily be misunderstood and made things somehow worse. By the end of the third boss, I had even concluded that, even if I offered advice, they might either not care or not understand. And by the end of the duty, I realized I was ultimately more interested in how well the rest of the team was performing. Then why did you spend this entire segment talking about the thaumaturge? I was recounting my experience. From what I could tell, the ninja did not know that using hide would recover ninjutsu charges, but they were using ninjutsu charges, which is already close to the peak of their potential at this level. The sage was attacking plenty and actually handled the huge pulls I was doing very well despite their limited options, and most importantly, I got the impression they weren't afraid to attack a bit even when I was taking a beating, without anyone dying as a result. A pretty fun run in retrospect. For Duty 4, we went to Origenics, and let's just say the scholar really liked to use physic. Like, what I mean by that is that there were a lot of situations where it was clear many other options were available and they decided to spam physic anyway. Given they watched the cutscene and was legitimately level 90, it is very possible this was their first go at this duty. However, it still seemed very odd to me they almost exclusively spammed physic heals on AoE packs. Even more so because boss fights opened probably with Chain Stratagem, Baneful Impaction and plenty of broil casts. Like, I'm just saying, I don't quite understand how attacking became so much less important once more mobs were on the field. Oh well, I guess we still made it through. Although, speaking of which, on the first boss, both the Scholar and the Dancer died to one of the first weird kinda half-room cleaves, and my rule for myself normally is that I will either ask for permission or just immediately wipe it if I'm the single last person alive. But because Paladin, I managed to keep the monk alive for the whole remainder of the fight. In retrospect, considering how early we were down to 2, I should probably had offered to wipe it a bit sooner. Although, also in retrospect, neither the Scholar or Dancer said a word when I brought it up. On this boss though, the most dangerous mechanic once you're down in player count is the line stack, which can absolutely kill a non-tank without help if you're only 2. It is also by far the scariest mechanic if you try to solo the duty, say with Warrior for instance. The boss does spend an absurd amount of time doing nothing threatening between these bursts though. A different detail associated with the physics spamming comes up on this turtle mob near the end of the duty. The first thing about it is that the turtle is immune to stuns, but not sleep, which means you could stop its hard stomp with a healer's repose cast. However, the stomp itself is perfectly livable by a melee DPS, so it is also a viable option to simply eat the damage and heal up. This can also eat up your healer's resources though, so not always optimal. However, and this is a strange scenario that can come up when your healer chooses to overspend time on spamming healing like physic. If your healer is going to spam heals anyway, a way to flip that potential damage loss into a gain is to eat otherwise avoidable damage to maximize your own damage. I know this sounds ridiculous, but this is part of the reason why sometimes, if you are a healer that really likes to spam healing spells, that it might feel like you have to. The reason might be that the rest of your party is trying to make the most of it, which by extension makes it necessary now because they're deliberately taking more damage than they had to for some reason. Like, a weird self-fulfilling prophecy. You cast healing spells instead of attacks, players stop avoiding damage as much, now you need healing spells to stay up. It is all a bit more complicated than this, and overall, mechanically, we were fine in the duty. However, if you are curious, I did make a video going over some of the more common mistakes healers and other roles make a while back, and this comes with probably slightly better explained reasonings for these kinds of things to go wrong. Link in the description to the healer video. On the final boss, both the Scholar and Dancer died to the Lion Psychokinesis. This time, I asked if we should wipe it then and there, and with no response, and the Monk dying shortly after, we ended up wiping it. On the run back, we had 0 deaths. Some of you might have been glancing at the duty time and getting concerned, but long story short, this duty, due to the many rooms and stuff, is kinda long. It didn't help that we had a wipe and a boss we did mostly 2 players, and that our healer didn't help much on AoE, but the duty is very long, so nearly 30 minutes with our situation sounds pretty understandable to me. For duty 5, we went to Hell's Lit, and the group was solid. On the first boss, we had an unfortunate incident where the machinist pretty much died just as the boss went down anyway. Aside from this, not much to say. On the first boss, I suppose, it is worth mentioning that when the boss drops its weapons and follows someone, to, first of all, not be in the way. And also that the boss does circle AoEs around its weapons when it picks them back up, so be careful with that. Also, keep in mind that the AoE pull after the second boss is pretty brutal and includes mobs that do frontal cleaves and tank busters, so if you do pull everything, be ready for big damage. For duty 6, we went to Brayflox Longstop again, and this was the run where it occurred to me that pulling the first packs up to the Goblin is actually a good idea. I was also somewhat regretting forgetting to bring my healing potions for this duty, as that could have made things a lot safer. However, that said, our White Mage was very good at making the most of their heals, and overall, the team was pretty good. I did notice the Red Mage was single targeting on AoE packs quite frequently though. It was particularly strange because I saw them start to cast AoE spells every so often. For duty 7, we went to Stabbing Front, which is one of the strangest guild tests. First, as a tank, the duty as a whole is so silly because you effectively just turn into a whirling tornado of death as you round up as many mobs as you can. At the same time, that completely misses the entire point of the duty. If you pay close attention, you'll see that some of the mobs labeled as chanters wield wands, but some of them also wield swords. The ones wielding swords are actually tanks, and the ones with wands are healers, so the intent, I guess, is that you need to kill the healers and try to ignore or at least prioritize the tanks very low. But you can just AoE everything. For duty 8, we went to M4N, Wicked Thunder. And it seemed we had a Black Mage as a first timer, so we had some time to talk. Nova brought up the subject of why Wicked Thunder is floating, and we had a bit of a laugh about that. Nova also turned out to be an absolute MVP for this fight. The first time the arena breaks, both the Black Mage and one of our healers fall, and on the immediately following threefold blast, the other healer and almost also Nova, our only remaining player with a res, goes down. Nova only gets hit once, so it is survivable. We get one of the healers back up and the fourfold blast is properly dodged. By the time the wing phase properly starts, everyone is back alive. The line AoEs that follow end up sniping our Reaper. A general tip for tanks here is that it may be an idea to overshoot a bit when moving Wicked Thunder around during this, so everyone else is safe to follow her around. The Shadow's Sabbath with 4 clones ends up taking out both our Black Mage and both healers once again. It isn't the easiest to see where the safe spots are after all. Before the arena breaks again, we have at least both healers alive again. The fivefold blast then takes out a healer, almost both healers. Next, the second wing phase takes down the Black Mage again. I'm just reiterating that it did appear to be their first time. This fight is not as easy as it seems. Speaking of which, the Shadow Sabbath with 4 clones takes down both healers again, which means we go into the final phase with one healer barely alive. We almost saw the 4th line stag in this final phase, which I would say is quite rare. As I mentioned earlier, Nova was an MVP in this whole run, and if we didn't have their reses, we would have absolutely wiped. For duty 9, we went to M1N, which was just a solid run. For those that Savage Raid, an interesting difference to Black Cat on normal is that when she breaks the arena, it feels less predictable. However, I have been told that she will always only break one of the northern innermost squares and only one of the southern innermost squares, essentially leaving a spot for the main tank and the rest of the party. That said, it isn't a bad idea to keep track of which of the 4 platforms will be hit twice, and simply try to avoid those in general. Another difference between Savage and Normal is exactly the mechanic that follows, where you get knocked up or down. On Normal, it is exclusively up, and the direction you get tossed is, of course, clearly shown as opposed to on Savage, but the direction is also based on your position relative to Black Cat, instead of which way you are facing. Of course, when she makes a clone to do it later, it is your position relative to the clone instead. Finally, for Duty 10, we went to Temple of the Fist, and both the healer and the Reaper said they either were first-timers or might as well be. The dungeon is pretty strange in general, with breakable walls for example. A detail in the starting section of the duty are these moss balls that are actually traps that get in your way if you step on them. The first boss turns into 2 bosses a bit ways into the fight, but even if the remainder powers up when the first one dies, I would say it is much easier to fight just one of them. The second boss can cleave either front and back, fore and aft, or sides, port and star, and also has the ability to counterattack 3 out of 4 directions, Killer Instinct, which should be respected. It hurts quite a bit. Its mechanic, Hell Seal, is also easy to misunderstand. It puts a marker over every player and lights up matching markers on the floor. The intended solution is to run to the marker that matches yours. The common misunderstanding, of course, being that the correct answer could just as easily have been the opposite. The area after the second boss has a lot of strong mobs too, so as a tank, it is likely you will find your invuln helpful here. Although, this is also where I noticed our healer didn't seem too fond of using Holy. Minor detail, they were also a returning player. They were attacking, which is good. The final boss has a handful of weird mechanics, but the scariest one by far is Touch of Slaughter, which sets the target to 1 HP, and I'm pretty sure he can use it on the tank, and if you don't respond fast enough, he just boinks you out of commission. Aside from that though, the fight is relatively manageable. This was a very fun set of duties with a lot of different experiences despite it being mostly dungeons. I do recognize it might feel like I get very caught up in the mistakes others are making sometimes, but the main purpose of this isn't to try and put them down for that, but simply for us all to learn and improve from them. Sometimes it is also just fascinating because every so often, the kinds of stories I share about the strange playstyles of players sound unbelievable to some, but having evidence can be quite funny. That said, I just want to also mention that the Wheel of Jobs now has just 1 healer and 1 tank left, so the probability of getting a DPS should be 85%. How strange. I wonder if the wheel is actually equally likely to land on all the options. Now, that is all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to support me and my channel more directly, you can become a member like these wonderful people here. You can also alternatively support me through Ko-Fi, link in the description. You can also support the channel by letting the YouTube algorithm know by liking the video, leaving a comment, subscribing, sharing, and hitting the bell to get notified when next I post a video. Fun fact, originally when Sheltron was added in Heavensward, it had a flat 30-second cooldown and no cost, and blocked the next attack, and restored some MP when it did so. A particularly interesting detail to this is that Paladin also had an attack called Shield Swipe, which could only be used after blocking, which did do damage, and by early Heavensward was made into an OGCD. Interesting synergy with tanking damage.